I installed this vertical shiplap wall for less than $50 and I'll show you exactly how. I'm Claire and today I'm showing you how to make your own budget-friendly shiplap boards and install them like a pro. First, let me show you the room layout so you can see how this all ties together. I've been renovating my office in phases. In phase one, I built this whole wall of built-ins. This was my first big built-in project, building everything from scratch. It provides 2 desk areas, lots of storage, and this ladder rail system that I built, including the ladder and these cute little library drawers. Let me know in the comments if you'd like me to do a video on this build or any of the parts of it. And in phase 2 was this other wall of built-ins. This was actually an old piece of furniture my dad built for me that I was using as a sewing hutch. It was starting to show many years of wear and tear, but I didn't want to lose this piece. So I took it apart and transformed it into this larger built-in with floor-to-ceiling storage while keeping some of the original features like these fold-down desks that stored my sewing machines. And then finishing off the wall by building these nooks to store the chairs for the sewing units and then creating some space for some decor. Back to this feature wall. Let's start with the materials we need for this project. So the product I'm using is called underlayment plywood, sometimes referred to as utility plywood. I purchased it from Home Depot in Canada. They also have a similar product in the US, and I also sourced some alternative materials you could use to achieve this exact same look. I'll break those down a little later in the video, and I'll also make sure to link everything in the description below. So this particular plywood comes in 2 thicknesses, 2.7 millimeters and 5 millimeters. I'm using the 2.7 millimeter for this project, and I will say that it's a little more tricky to work with since it can flex more, but I'll share my tips for making this easier a little later on in the video. But the reason why I'm using the thinner option on this wall is because I didn't want to cover up too much of the trim on this built-in. Okay, let's move on to the design and layout of this feature wall. I'm doing a vertical application of shiplap on this wall. The vertical boards give a modern twist to the traditional look, and it draws the eye upwards, which helps make 8-foot ceilings look taller. And you don't have to go full wall either to get the effect. Here's how I used it on just the top half above wainscoting. But you can also install these boards horizontally as well. Just keep in mind, since we are cutting these from plywood, the longest length you are going to get from a board is 8 feet. Therefore, if your wall is wider than 8 feet, you will have seams between your boards very similar to this traditional shiplap wall I installed many years ago. If you want to avoid the seams, it works well on narrower walls or accents like this. Or another option would be to get creative by separating the boards with trim. The design ideas are endless with these boards. So the first thing I did was calculate the amount of shiplap I was going to need for my wall. Traditional shiplap boards are normally between 5 and 6 inches wide. And this underlayment plywood we are using comes in 4-foot by 8-foot sheets, which is 48 by 96 inches. This means I can get around 8 boards per sheet. So I started by measuring my wall, which was 123 inches wide, which meant I would need 3 sheets of this underlayment plywood, and then divided my wall width by 24, as this is how many boards I can get out of the 3 sheets. And that worked out to 5 1/8. So since I was going to be having an 1/8 of an inch gap between each board, that meant my boards were going to be 5 inches in width. And to make your own faux shiplap boards, all you're doing is simply ripping down your sheet of plywood to your desired board width. I'm using my rip guide here to cut these down to the right width. This is one of my favorite and most used tools. It attaches right to your circular saw and it allows you to rip down large sheets of plywood without needing a table saw. You just slide the ruler guide till you line up with your exact measurement, and then you lock that bar in place. Then using the cutout handle, you slide the guide along the edge of your plywood, applying even pressure, and you rip your boards. I'm just using 2x4s to support my wood here, but I highly recommend getting a foam insulation board. They're inexpensive and it gives you more support as you're making your cuts. The edges of this plywood can be a little splintery, so you're going to want to sand down those edges to make sure they're nice and smooth and to knock off any of those splintering pieces. You may want to wear gloves for this part. I just hand sanded these with my Gator sanding block, which I love, by the way. But I'm also using these underlayment boards to shiplap a ceiling in my home right now, and I used my palm sander and sanded all the edges all at once, which is really efficient, so that's another option as well. So once I had all my boards cut, I primed them. I find this so much easier to do this first before they're on the wall. That way you can get the edges really well. This is an important step because this is a plywood product. You want to make sure there are no voids in the edges and that they are fully painted on the sides. Once these are on the wall, you don't really see the edges, and the paint does a great job of filling those voids, but if you do have a deeper one, use some wood filler. After one coat of primer, they need to be sanded. Don't miss this step. It's crucial for getting a really smooth finish for your final coat of paint, and that includes those edges too. I use the Gator sanding sponges for the edges and my palm sander for the fronts. As with all lumber, this plywood can also vary in quality, so take your time at the lumber store and make sure you're picking through for the best selection. If you do happen to have any knots or imperfections showing through, just make sure to fill those first with wood filler. After I'm done sanding, I actually find it easier to just run the vacuum along them to get all the debris and dust, and then just give it a quick wipe with a cloth. Because this plywood is so thin, it's very easy to cut around for electrical boxes. However, it also makes it flimsy, so you have to make sure once you've made your cuts that it doesn't break. I learned this the hard way. This board did snap on me when I was going to install it, so my tip to you is to be extra careful and support those areas well. So I was able to patch this back together by gluing the seam and clamping it while it dried, and then wood filling over top. A little tip I used here was to put a piece of parchment paper underneath my seam. That way, if any glue leaked through, I wasn't going to glue my board to my table. I also sanded the seam immediately, so the sawdust acted like natural wood filler and helped blend the seam area. And once that was dry, I applied a little wood filler to fill in any areas the sawdust didn't. I waited for that to dry and then sanded it smooth and then primed over it. And then once it was fully painted over, you can't even tell that there was a seam there. So it did fix it, but learn from my mistakes and be extra careful when installing these boards around areas you've cut out. Then it's time to start applying the boards to your wall. You'll want to loosen all your electrical switches. Because this product is so thin, it just slides right underneath, and then you can retighten it once you have them installed. These first few boards are a little tricky just getting around the switches, but after that it was fairly smooth sailing. An important tip here is to not go off your trim or your wall edges unless you have checked to make sure that they are level. It's crucial that your first board is level so that all the rest of the boards follow suit. To apply these boards to the wall, I'm using my brad nailer and my pin nailer. My brad nailer uses 18 gauge nails. They have a small head and more holding power, great for nailing into studs, but they also leave a slightly bigger hole to fill. My pin nailer takes 23 gauge nails. These are headless and nearly invisible, and they only need a little bit of wood filler. To make these cuts around the switches, I'm making the cross cuts by clamping the board against the fence of my miter saw and cutting down to my marked lengths. Because I'm using the thinner underlayment here, it's fairly easy to cut through. So for the rest of this cut, I scored the edge with a utility knife and then used a chisel to cut through the rest. You could also use a multi-tool. I did this for some of the cuts. You'll see that closer to the end. And also a jigsaw could work too, but I would recommend that more for the 5mm boards just because jigsaws tend to create quite a lot of vibration when they cut, and the 5mm boards are more sturdy to handle it. And then, like I mentioned before, I loosened the screws for this light switch and then pulled them out just about 1/8 of an inch, slid this board behind, and then tightened the screws. I made sure for these boards around the electrical boxes to dry fit them first by placing spacers between the boards and then taping them in place before nailing them in. As I'm nailing the boards, I like to mark the holes with a little piece of painter's tape. This may seem a little tedious, but I swear it makes the process so much faster and less daunting in the end. I filled the holes in these first two boards with wood filler, and because they are so small, it dried really quickly and I was able to sand it and then move on to the next. To get that perfect shiplap gap, I used wooden paint stir sticks, the free ones from Home Depot. On their side, they're exactly 1/8 of an inch. They're lightweight, and it's easy to keep plenty of them on hand. And they wedge in perfectly between the boards. And if you put a little piece of painter's tape underneath, this holds them in place while you're dry fitting your boards. I found it best to dry fit each board by taping in my spacers and then taping my next board to the previous one. This allowed me to double check my level before nailing in each board. The key for nailing these boards and not gluing them is to angle your nails both up and down on the same area of the board. Angling your nails away from each other is what's going to hold the board tight to the wall. And this is crucial when you don't have studs that you're nailing into. So I started the process of filling the nail holes by actually putting a piece of painter's tape down first, nailing through that, and then filling with a wood filler over top. But I did actually find that when I did it this way, I didn't really get a great fill on the nail hole, even though these are very small holes to fill. So after doing that for about half the wall, I went back to just marking the nail holes with the tape. This way I knew where to come back and sand afterwards because the white wood filler did blend in quite well with the primer and I wanted to make sure I didn't miss any areas. For my next electrical box, I lined up my board into position, marked the top and the bottom of the electrical box with painter's tape, and this gave me the height position of where to cut. And then I just took my spacer and measured with my measuring tape to the end of the electrical box, and then took that measurement and transferred it onto my board. And then I just used the same process on my miter saw to make the cuts, and then my chisel to cut out the rest of the section, and then slid that right behind, tightened up the screws, and installed the board. And then I just kept plugging away, getting the boards installed with the same method of using the spacers and dry fitting it and then getting it nailed in. And so one of my biggest tips during the install process is just to do the nail filling as you go. This way is just not a tedious job afterwards. Instead of all at once, you're just getting it done as you get the wall installed. For my last outlet, I needed to cut it out of the middle of the board, unlike the previous one where I was able to cut it out of the side. So to do this, I just took really accurate measurements of where the electrical box was, transferred that onto my board, and then used the X-Acto knife and the chisel method to pop out the center part. You will see from the vast amounts of green painter's tape that I used to mark my nail holes that I used a lot of nails to fix these boards to the wall. And that's because I really wanted to make sure these boards were tight to the wall. You could use some sort of glue or construction adhesive, but it's really important to note that if you do plan to take this down in the future, you will damage your drywall by using any kind of adhesive, which will result in lots of repairs or maybe even having to re-drywall. So having lots of little tiny pinholes is an easier fix in the big picture. To sand the filled nail holes, I'm using these Gator micro sanders. They give you great control and work really well for small detailed areas like this. I'm a big fan of this brand. I have 220 grit sandpaper on here and it just velcros on and then it's super easy to swap out. They are perfect for little touch-ups like these. For this last section, I needed to cut around a few areas of the built-in. For this lower board here, I needed to cut around where the desk jets out. So I found it easiest just to create a template by taping all these stir sticks together and then just fitting it in and then taking that back to my board and then tracing it out. And then I made my two cross cuts where it meets the desk by doing the same method of clamping it to my miter saw and coming down to my depth mark. And then for the rest of the area, I just clamped a board as a guide and used my multi-tool to run along it to get the rest of that length in that section out. And then the last section that was a little bit tricky was getting around the ladder rail, as the bar for the ladder rail went directly right up to the wall. So to do this, I lined up my board to the edge of the ladder rail and then made a couple of marks where it lined up. Then I measured the depth of where the hole needed to be and drilled that hole. Then I cut this piece out here marked with the green tape, slid this board over the ladder rail into place, and then patched that little piece up behind. And it worked out pretty well. You can't really see that it's patched there. And that was the last board to get installed. So before I show you how I painted this, I'm just going to run through some of the other materials that you could use for this job, as I mentioned earlier. So as a reminder, this is what I use, the 2.7 millimeter, and it also comes in 5 millimeter. So this first US option is a 1/8 of an inch utility plywood, and this is the closest to what I used. The next is a slightly thicker underlayment, but very similar to what I used as well. And this last underlayment plywood option is the thickest one, closer to the 5 millimeter. And these last two are hardboards. They're really great options as well. They're a little bit smoother. You don't have to worry about the splintering edges. The only downfall is that they're not stainable. And then back to the reveal of this wall. So once it was all done, I just wiped it down really well to get rid of any of the dust from sanding the wood filler, taped off my baseboard and my top molding, and then it was ready for the last step and to top coat it with paint. And I chose a beautiful sage green color. It's actually called Sage Gray, and it's from Home Depot's Bear Marquee line. To paint the wall, I worked in small sections, starting with a brush to get in the grooves, and then immediately rolled the paint over the boards. You'll see that I only painted about a third of the boards at a time to prevent the paint from drying at the edges before I could blend it in. You've probably seen lots of people paint the grooves first when they're painting shiplap. But the problem with that is that it can leave visible lines once everything has dried. This method gives you a smooth and more flawless finish. I did 2 coats of finishing paint, and this is how the wall turned out. I saved over $300 doing it this way, less than $2 a board instead of $15, and it completely transforms the space with texture and depth. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more budget-friendly DIYs, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button and check the description for all the supplies I use. And lastly, as I'm growing my channel, I'd love to hear your feedback, what you found helpful, what you would like to see more of, so I can create content that's both useful and fun to watch. Thanks so much for watching.